excludes and functions creep. I think this is really a very pertinent topic in the context of a digital Bangladesh that we are all trying to craft. So I think this particular research is going to be extremely useful for us to think carefully and thoughtfully about the whole area of digital innovations and how those interact with underlying structures, and in what context they can actually help, and in what context it can reinforce existing power structures and exclusion. Because ultimately what we all are concerned about is effective public service delivery. And if that's what we care about, then I think it's really important that we take a very critical perspective and learn from other country context experiences in terms of how these digital innovations and digital identity in particular has really played itself out in practice. So that's what the talk is going to be about. We have Professor Mushtaq Khan and Pallavi Roy both work at SOAS. Pallavi Roy is a research director of DFID's ACE, which is Anti-Corruption Evidence. This is a research partnership consortia, and a lecturer in international economics at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS. I would also like to mention that, and this is really I found very interesting, that before becoming an academic, Pallavi worked for over a decade as a financial journalist at the coalface in India, reporting on the economic conflicts unleashed by land acquisition of mining for infrastructure and development, and more generally the changes in patterns of corruption and rent-seeking as South Asian economies began to achieve growth accelerations and then began to liberalize. I think this whole activism and research is a fascinating sort of combination, and I'm sure Pallavi will bring that out in terms of her talk today as well. We have Professor Mushtaq Khan. Is a chief executive of the ACE Research Consortia and professor of economics at SOAS. And both have worked extensively on institutional economics, political settlements, which is a framework that you'll hear a lot about today, applied in the context of digital identities, and they've worked on governance, anti-corruption issues in many countries in Asia and Africa. So without further ado, please join hands in welcoming the two speakers, and welcome very much.
Thank you, Imran Bhai, and for all the audience to take the effort to come to listen to a title which might look a bit obscure. But I think that the issue that we are addressing here is becoming of huge importance, not just in Bangladesh but globally. In fact, I should warn you that the evidence that we are going to talk about comes not from Bangladesh, which is useful, because then you can compare with. So a lot of it will come from India, and Pallavi has really ground level experience of India, but also Africa, where these digital identity systems are being rolled out at a very rapid pace. So what is the background to this? Digital identities are basically numbers. They are numbers which are on a computer somewhere, and these numbers are linked to each individual in a population and can then be linked to their welfare rights, tax contributions, nationality or resident status, their bank accounts, their SIM cards. I think in Bangladesh we know how this happens. They've emerged as very powerful tools to assist the enforcement of formal rights, and there is a huge support for this kind of technology from a lot of progressive people who are fighting for social inclusion and for delivering services, as Imran said, to the population. They have also been heralded as a tool for anti-corruption and fraud in public service delivery, because the idea is that if citizens know what they are entitled to, and that number can be linked to the delivery of a sum of money or a sack of rice, then you can track very carefully very precisely, in theory, what is happening to the public delivery system. That's the theory. There's also a lot of literature which says digital identity systems create new markets because you can begin to trade online without knowing the identity of that person or their credit worthiness, because the digital identity itself allows you to get your money back if something happens, right? So it opens up new markets, whereas if you had to rely on traditional identity, establishing the credibility of the buyer and the seller, you have very high transaction costs in developing countries, right? So the idea is that digital identities open up new markets online. You can buy and sell on phone, you can send money, etc. And finally, digital identity is supposed to increase national security because you can identify who is supposed to be here and who is not supposed to be here. And you can then not only get rid of the people who are not supposed to be here, you can also trace what the people who are supposed to be here are doing and pick them up if they are doing wrong things, right? So you have a huge tool for security. In fact, a lot of these systems developed after 9/11 in advanced countries. We are going to use India's Aadhaar system, which is the most advanced digital identity system, as one of our exemplars of what can go wrong with the system and what can go right with the system. The Aadhaar system in India is used by the World Bank in many publications as a classic case of a successful digital identity system. It's changing a little bit now because people are becoming aware of the serious problems with the Aadhaar system, but you will find many publications where Aadhaar is presented as an example of a very successful system. But many other countries are now developing it, and the World Bank, OECD, DFID, many agencies are very over-optimistic, in our opinion, of the advantages of digital identity systems. A classic publication is the World Bank's Digital Identity Toolkit, which is just a kind of really positive spin on the whole system. However, when you look at the evidence, and now there have been masses of studies on how this has been implemented, and our paper is really evaluating these studies, going through them, you find a very mixed picture. The mixed picture is that sometimes UIDs have a positive effect, but often they result in a negative effect, and they result in new forms of exclusion and extraction. And we are developing a theory, we are going to present you a theory which allows us to explain why this is the case. It's not an accident. And the answer basically is it depends on the type of violation you're looking at. For some types of violation, UIDs reduce the violation. But for other types of violation, UID is an instrument for enhancing that violation. So we will present you with some analytical frame to justify this claim, and then we will show you the evidence from studies which validate our assessment. The analytical case is based on criticizing the simplistic theory of why UIDs reduce fraud and corruption and enhance the transaction simplicity. This idea is based on what in economics is called asymmetric information. Asymmetric information means that if I am transacting with you, or I am a public servant and you are a citizen, if I know something that you don't know, then I can cheat you. That's it. This is a very simple idea. So if one side has information, if the public servant, the politician, or one side of a transaction has information that the other side doesn't, you will have a bad contract, you will have extraction. And so the theory says that as information becomes more symmetric, you will get a better outcome. I am the citizen, I know my entitlement, you are the public official, you know my entitlement, now how are you going to cheat me? I'm going to say this is my entitlement, you're supposed to give it to me. This is the theory. There is one basic problem with this theory. The theory assumes that you have a rule of law. Now, this is a concept that most people don't understand what it means. A rule of law doesn't mean that you have a law in your country and the law is enforced. Every country has laws and the laws are enforced. But the rule of law is something much more than that. A rule of law says the law will be enforced regardless of the identity of the violator, regardless of the power of the violator, regardless of the political connections and economic assets of the violator. If we have a violator, the probability of enforcement is just the same as if that person is a pauper or the owner of Microsoft. It could be the American president or it could be someone on the street. If they break a law, there is a process. And the process will not look at the identity of the people. Now, of course, as you know, no country has this in a strict sense, but there is a range of variation. And this range of variation is so big that it's important to say, have a theory of what happens when your rule of law is weak. The law is enforced, but it's enforced partially. It's enforced on some people, it's not enforced on other people. What happens then? Now, our argument is this is a typical situation in a developing country. There are laws, there are enforcement, there is police, there is courts, but everybody is not equal. If you have a rule of law, then information is power. As soon as I have information that you have violated something, I can get it to be enforced, and therefore information equals power. But this is only if you have a rule of law. Our proposition is that the distribution of power in developing countries, this is what we call the political settlement, is such that you don't have a rule of law. What we have instead is what we call rule by law. There are laws and the powerful use these laws to rule. Is rule by law. If you are a thief and you have stolen money, you have a high probability of getting punished if you have stolen from a more powerful person. But if you are a powerful person and you have stolen from a less powerful person, you have a much lower probability of being punished. In fact, in some cases, zero probability of being punished, but it's a scale. This analysis of rule by law and rule of law is really important for us to understand, because it affects all kinds of economic policy and so on in developing countries. I won't go into it that much here, but the political settlements analysis is something that goes into it in great depth. The analytical question for us is, what is the relationship between asymmetric information and asymmetric power when you don't have a rule of law? Okay? If there is a rule of law, information is power. But what happens if you don't have a rule of law? And here is the proposition. The proposition is that if you have rule by law and you reduce the information asymmetry, then sometimes the power asymmetry may become less, but sometimes the power asymmetry may become more. In other words, if information gives information to the powerful, they can use this information to extract more efficiently. They can use this information to repress more efficiently. They can use this information to stay in power more efficiently. Okay? So in some cases, this information actually increases the asymmetry of power, and we will see huge evidence of this. And just ask yourself, who are the countries who are really running to have digital identity systems? Are all the authoritarian regimes in the world, right? If digital identity reduced the asymmetry of power, you would not have authoritarian regimes running to implement digital identity systems. So this in itself tells you something, okay? So the basic proposition is very simple. Information is a weapon for the powerful precisely when you don't have a system of power which can enforce rules on the powerful. And the basic fact is we don't have it. This is not a Bangladesh problem, it's an Indian problem, it's a Pakistani problem, it's a Nigerian problem, it's a developing country problem. And anyone who does economic policy assuming that you have a rule of law is making a huge mistake. So, let me quickly move on to the difference between the advanced country discussion of identity systems and the developing country discussion. Advanced countries are also against identity systems. Many advanced countries, like the UK, have blocked, Parliament has blocked the introduction of a digital identity system. Okay? But the reason why they have blocked it is slightly different from the reasons we are talking about. What we are talking about is more than what people in advanced countries are worried about. What the people in advanced countries are worried about are less important from our perspective, but they're not unimportant. What are they concerned about? The main concern in advanced countries is the issue of privacy. Privacy means, why should I give information to the government that the government does not need, but this is my private information? In other words, I may have visited a country, I may have gone there with someone who is not my wife, I may have gone there with someone who is my business partner. If I have not broken a law, why does the state have to know this information? This is my private information. If I have broken the law, yes, you can know. But if I have not broken the law, why should I know? Why should you know? And if you know and you misinterpret this information, and you then use this information to deny me of access to credit, I have very high transaction costs in finding which record has this wrong information and how do I correct it. And once it is in the record and you don't know where in the record it is, you may have a low credit rating or you may have a low whatever security rating. You might be blocked from visiting a country because you are on some security red flag, but you don't know what this red flag is and whether it is right or wrong and how do you correct it. So this is a privacy concern. It's a transaction cost concern, but in principle, once you know where the mistake is, you can correct it because you have a rule of law. The other concern in advanced countries is what is known as network economies of scale. This is a very important concept. The nature of economics has changed very fundamentally in the last 20 years. Now, the monopolies are making super profit not by restricting entry into the market like in the old days. You know, if you are an economist, Economics 101, if you want to make excess profit, you block entry into your market. But actually now the monopolies, the FANGs are the new monopolies. I'm sure you know what the FANGs are. Facebook, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Netflix, Google, etc. Right? The FANGs are the main problem in advanced countries. They don't know how to regulate them. You don't know how to regulate them because the FANGs are monopolies with complete open access. There is no restriction of entry into the market, but no one can enter the market. Why? Because they have access to data, and the data creates network economies of scale. Those who already have the data can process it and can offer a cheaper product, really a cheaper product, than those who don't have the data. And then you don't need to restrict entry. Google can say it is open access, anyone can set up, but actually no one can enter. So this is a new monopoly. And this has completely changed economics upside down. In the old days, when you broke a monopoly, you would get lower prices. Nowadays, if you break a monopoly, you get higher prices. Right? So no one wants to break the monopoly, but it means that the monopoly has enormous control over your economy. Right? Much more than in developing country. If you go to an advanced country, these big players have a huge control over. Now, I'm just mentioning these things because you need to know about it, but this is not our problem. Right? They will become our problem eventually, but our problem is much more severe and much more fundamental. In the developing country, the problem is not network economies, it's not privacy. The problem is that the regulations that we have to protect ourselves from this digital data, and to construct this analytics of what we are saying, we make a distinction between 4 different kinds of violations. The 2 rows, so let me begin with the 2 columns. The 2 columns are the nature of the rule that is being violated. Is the rule a difficult to follow rule or an easy to follow rule? So think of in a developing country there are many rules, but many rules cannot be followed because the rules are actually bad rules. And nobody has corrected the rule because everybody knows that I will not have to follow the rule. Right? So we have a lot of rules which you can't follow. Businesses can't follow these rules. People can't follow these rules. So the first column are rules which are difficult and no one can comply with them unless you want to have a loss-making company or suffer huge loss. The second column are rules which you could follow, but violators don't want to follow them because they make a lot of money by violating those rules. And our proposition is that there's a huge difference between rules that actually can't be followed and rules that can be followed. They are good rules, but I still decide to violate them. And then we look at who is violating, the two rows. And the first row is the violator is a powerful violator. And the lower row is a violator is not a powerful violator relative to the people they are violating. This gives us 4 kinds of violations. And we are basically going to argue that in 2 of these boxes, boxes 1 and 4, digital identities reduce violations. But in 2 of those boxes, 2 and 3, digital identities actually increase violations. And these are really severe areas of economic and political extraction. So what we are going to do now is to go through each of these boxes and then look at the established evidence on other people's studies, a lot of it from India, which is going to validate what we are saying. Okay, so let's look at the first box. The first box are rules that are difficult to follow, but the people who are breaking them are powerful people. This is basically what the World Bank focuses on in its doing business reforms. There are lots of rules which businesses can't follow. Okay? Here, information can have a positive effect by showing that the powerful are breaking rules, and what happens then? The rules get changed. The rules get changed because the powerful will then use their access to politics and so on to simplify the rules so they can comply with them. In fact, if you look at the doing business over the years, most developing countries have made huge progress in simplifying rules. I don't know if everyone knows doing business, doesn't matter. These are basically measures of how difficult it is to do business. And Bangladesh, like most other developing countries, have made a lot of progress in simplifying these rules. I'll now hand over to... Okay, so the way we are doing it is that we are going to have a flip-flop between Pallavi and myself. And I'm going to talk about the boring theoretical stuff, and she's going to talk about the interesting empirical stuff. So, over to you.
Thank you, Mushtaq, for giving me the easier part of the presentation. But the evidence for us was extremely interesting to look at because it validates the framework that we've set out for you. Mushtaq spoke about the ease of doing business reforms, and just to give you a little taster menu also, you might be aware that India has moved up by the Indian government's assertion at least quite fantastically in terms of the doing business rankings. It's made, for instance, bankruptcy easier. It's made getting certain kinds of contract regulations easier. But that really hasn't translated into any kind of economic performance for the Indian economy. In fact, as if you follow the Indian economy, it's going through one of its worst phases. So even where digital identities help you with ease of doing business, and we do say that for box 1, it certainly can happen. For the small and medium manufacturer who does not want to necessarily be corrupt, does not want to keep paying bribes again, digitizing, let's say, registration of the company or digitizing paying tax can actually be helpful. You don't have the grade 4 clerk coming and telling you, well, I'm not going to register till you pay me the bribe. You can do it online. So it does help to that extent. How much it does, I think India is an excellent example of how it also does not. But if you want to simplify certain things, yes, this is certainly where things can get easy for you. What the Indians have managed to do is with something called the Unified Payments Interface, which is essentially a payment platform. I won't get into the technology of it. It's just that it's literally app-based. You download it on your phone, you link it to your various bank accounts, and the bank accounts talk to each other through this unified payments interface. It has made life very easy, but then you go back to the kind of concerns that Mushtaq was speaking about with the developed country concerns, which is security and privacy. That's become a huge issue of concern. If countries like the UK and the US can't manage it, India, despite its sort of digital advancement, isn't a country that can take care of this framework either. India's moved up from 142 to 77, which is quite a fair leap, but in terms of whether it's improved economic performance, we know that the jury's decided that's not been the case. In many other countries, of course, we know from African instances, other South Asian instances, Latin American instances also, just being able to apply online for your passport or your driving license actually makes life much easier. So we're not being, as the term would go, we're not anti-technology people, we are not Luddites. We're saying that, there is a place and there is a sort of context where a digital identity works and where it isn't, and Mushtaq will continue with the framework from here.
Thank you. So this is clearly an area where digital identities, international evidence, and we have given you just a sample, has improved outcomes. So just to remind you what this is where the powerful are suffering because of bad rules. Digital identities makes it transparent that the rules are bad, they're not working, and then you change the rules because some of the powerful want the rules to change. Let's now move to the second type of violation, where, and this is really getting much more interesting, where the rules are difficult, but the violators are not powerful. Now, what are these? This is the massive informal economy and the SME sector in developing countries. You have a whole bunch of rules that most of these people cannot follow. The formal rules are not fit for purpose. Now what happens when you say, we will digitize this, and you will now do your land registration online, you will do your tax payment online, you will do your transactions cashless. What is going to happen? The man with the basket on his head or her head with some fish doesn't know what this means. They cannot comply with all these rules and regulations, and they are not powerful enough to make the rules fit for their purpose. They don't have the political voice in these countries to change the rules, to make the rules work for them. So what happens then is what we call in our work premature formalization. And when you have premature formalization, you basically kill the SME sector. And this is actually what has happened in India. The reason why their growth has gone from something like 8% to something like 4% is because Mr. Modi, in his bid to make everything digital, one of the unintended consequences, or maybe intended consequences, was to kill off the SME sector. The second thing that happens here is that when you know that a lot of people are violating rules and they can't hide it anymore because it's now digital, it gives the powerful the instrument to control. I know you are violating this rule. If you don't vote for me or if you don't come and give me a bribe, I will use this to shut you down. So now you have two kinds of extraction. One is that this information allows the powerful to extract better. But secondly, the extraction might be so big, you just close down the damn business. And then you have premature formalization. We unfortunately have quite a lot of evidence that this is happening, and this is what Pallavi is going to go to now.
Right. Now, Nigeria is another context that we've worked in quite a bit. The NIMC cards are the Nigerian Identity Management Commission cards, and the Nigerians have had a policy for quite some time, though it's not been very successful. The World Bank is now spending enormous amounts of money in Nigeria pushing this digital identity project. But yes, there is some evidence that, if you had an identity card, you could walk into a bank, and because you had the identity, you could demand to open a bank account. And the classic reason that a lot of multilateral donors, bilateral donors put forward for digital identity is financial inclusion. If people don't have an identity, we cannot include them in financial markets for transactions simply because you don't know who you're transacting with. So the World Bank said, great, go ahead, provide these NIMC cards, and people did open their bank accounts. But it was later discovered that that didn't really help in terms of financial inclusion. To simply, now I might be fairly poor, quite poor, and I might have the identity card, but if I want to go and ask for a loan because I want to start a small business, I'm not collateralized enough. And identity is not the only thing that a bank is looking for when the bank wants to provide you with a loan. What assets are you backed up with? And if you don't have that, just having the identity doesn't really matter. So you're excluded. You might be providing the person with the identity, but this is another form of exclusion because you're not actually looking at the main problem, which is the person doesn't have that net worth to pick up the loan. Kenya, very similar things happened. You link digital identity. And Kenya, by the way, forget India, forget Bangladesh. Kenya is the country which is the benchmark country in terms of mobile payments, mobile wallets, and technology for financial inclusion through digital methods. That is genuinely the benchmark country that all developing countries are looking at. It's not India. It's not certainly South Asia, Bangladesh, Bikash. But in Kenya, they linked digital identities to credit histories. So your identity actually had information on whether you had a bad or a good credit history. But once again, we saw that they were able to reduce non-performing loans, which might seem like a good thing, that's efficiency in your banking sector. You're only paying loans to people who can pay them back. But why were they able to exclude non-performing loans? That's largely because people without credit records were just not being part of the financial system. This is again the irony of I'm including you, but I just don't, for the rest of the population who wants access to credit, they were just shut out of the financial system. So that automatically reduces non-performing loans. You're not giving out enough loans, right? And the other thing that Mushtaq spoke about, what we call premature formalization. This, in fact, is a study, the last study that we quote here, the 2018 study, is a study across developing and developed country SMEs. This is not just developing country SMEs, which is that you could have a highly digitized and a highly formalized system of regulations for small and medium enterprises, but it's only the bigger SMEs who had enough capability to comply, and that's important. Compliance is expensive. You have to be capable enough to pay the taxes. You also have to be large enough, at some point, as Mushtaq said, when the bribe collector comes, you've suddenly, you're on the radar now, you're supposed to be paying taxes, and this man says to register you need to pay a bribe. A lot of the smaller SMEs simply shut down. And this evidence is quite compelling in Africa. In the other sort of developed countries, it's the cost of being compliant and the cost of sticking to the enforcement that actually makes the smaller SMEs unproductive. Something that's been happening in India is the imposition of the general sales tax, which is the equivalent of the value-added tax in India, and this was also heralded as one how should I put it? One magic bullet with which the Indian economy would see a lot of growth. We've actually seen quite the opposite happen. Two important things in India: demonetization, which I'm sure all of you are very aware of. It's the stuff that myths are made of now. Demonetization and the imposition of the GST. They were supposed to be the two magic bullets with which, in one fell swoop, India would regain, stellar GDP status, 8% GDP growth. Well, none of that has happened. Both of them were attempts at formalizing. Both of them, and certainly demonetization, has led to premature formalization in the economy at levels of per capita GDP which are completely unsustainable. India is a country which is still at about $2,000 GDP per capita. At that level, expecting the vast swathe of SMEs to comply with these kind of regulations is absolutely unfair. But that's what's been happening, right? And what is now happening, and we have enough studies which say that a lot, and I originally come from West Bengal, and there are enough studies that the smaller and the really small SMEs, really subsistence SMEs, have pretty much gone out of the picture after the imposition of the GST. West Bengal has been one of the states which has a higher level of informalization. It's been more adversely affected with both demonetization as well as the imposition of the GDP. And they're now making it quite mandatory that GST payment should be linked to PAN card, and I think PAN cards are also here prevalent in Bangladesh. Similar TIN. That's the equivalent, and linking it to the Aadhaar card. And the evidence across the board has been this has been very unsuccessful with SMEs struggling. It has been good for SMEs who are more productive. That's our quadrant 1, but not for the SMEs that are struggling. The African SME sector is actually even far more in a problematic way, because at least in South Asia we have SMEs which are generally more productive. Most African SMEs, and we have examples from Uganda, we have examples from Kenya, these are pretty much subsistence SMEs. So attempts at formalizing them have only led to them falling out of levels of economic growth, really. And Mushtaq said that we are now getting into the really interesting portion of the presentation, and that's what we are coming to. The evidence of the link between 2 and 3 actually happens to be the most egregious, and this is, I think, where our evidence is also the most powerful.
Okay, so now I go from box 2, which is where the less powerful are violating rules that are difficult to follow, to box 3, which is where the powerful are deliberately violating rules because it's in their interest to violate them. This is the area where you have high-level political extraction in developing countries and high-level political control in developing countries. And we see this across developing countries. This is not a criticism of any particular developing country. This is a common phenomenon across developing countries. Here, what is going on is that the powerful are extracting because they are powerful. Because I can get my bank loan and not repay it. Because I can capture this land and nothing will happen to me. Because I can get this contract, because I know who is giving the contract, and I make a deal with the person giving me the contract. These kinds of political linked contracting is not based on asymmetric information. Often this happens completely openly, and everybody knows what is happening, and nothing will happen to the people who are violating these contracts. But here is the problem. When those people have information about what everybody else is doing, their power becomes even more asymmetric. This is something that I think most people did not expect from this whole digital identity discussion. This was the most unexpected result. That actually, the access to this digital information makes the powerful who are breaking rules even more powerful in breaking the rules. And then you have this really adverse link between boxes 3 and 2. So what happens is the powerful says, not only am I breaking the rules and you can't do anything about it, I know you are breaking rules and I can do something about it. I have caught you not paying your tax. Ask yourself one thing, right? After Mr. Modi did all this damage to the business sector, not one businessman complained openly. Bajaj recently opened their mouth and was immediately shut up. Why does no business house in India open their mouth against the government doing damaging things? It's because everyone in India is breaking some rules. And now the government knows exactly who is breaking which rule. So you have basically stopped all political voice. Yeah? As soon as you want to protest, the government will say, actually, let me have a tax inquiry. I can link it to all your accounts and all your information. And then the businessman, and we are not even talking about the SME now, we are talking about mid-sized or large business people become shut. So this link between 3 and 2 is, I think, the core part of our paper. This is not something that people have caught before, but the evidence shows that this is happening. So over to Pallavi to give us some hints about this evidence.
Right. Back to India, but in this case we also have a fair few examples from Africa. The thing about the UID technology is, unlike, let's say, technology being developed 30 to 40 years ago, most of this technology is being developed by the private sector. And most of the citizens in these countries have actually no idea what goes into the backbone that's being developed and the data that is being trapped by private sector players. And very little information on the ownership structure of the private sector or in terms of data security is actually shared by citizens. I mean, I would think the lot of you and us sitting here have a pretty good idea of our rights and what our rights should be. But trust me when I say that across the developing world, and certainly in countries who are developing these technologies, we have very little idea of what's actually going on behind the scene. Let me give you a few examples here from the India story. Now, in India, and you will, the World Bank and this organization called GSMA, which is actually a mobile, it's a third sector platform for mobile telephony and inclusion. They were very encouraging in terms of developing something called the India Stack. It's actually a host of applications which anybody in the private sector can contribute into. And here's the thing, it is overseen by a third, and I did a straw poll the last time that I was in India. How many of you have heard of iSpirit? Most Indians of the kinds that you and I are well educated, well aware of our rights, had no idea that something as crucial as payments that I'm downloading into my phone, that I'm using every day for very, very important transactions in my life, this is being administered by a third sector company. I don't even know what third sector means in this case, really. What are the contractual obligations of the third sector company? And, this is the Indian example because this is public, but this is pretty much what is happening in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Ghana, which is also now pretty much at the forefront of adopting this digital technology. And here's the other interesting sort of revolving door. A lot of people who were in what is India's UIDAI, which is the authority behind the Aadhaar, a lot of public officials who were part of the government-funded Aadhaar, which is a part of the Ministry of Electronics, have actually gone on to to create startups. Now, to our mind, that's really a conflict of interest out there. But this is the power, this is the asymmetric power that a lot of the private sector now has in developing countries, over which most of us have no oversight. The government is very happy to outsource this deployment and this development of technology to the private sector, and most of us are very unaware. And for us, this actually stays in quadrant 3, because they could technically, be open, be more transparent, but there are very few windows that we have into their activities. And this is not getting terribly egregious now. We get into the more damaging examples later, but this is also an instance of how we simply don't know, and these private sector players are in a position to exploit the fact that we don't have enough information. That's what makes them extremely powerful. The other interesting example comes from Kenya. And as I just told you, Kenya is now the benchmark for financial inclusion using digital technology. And here's the interesting thing. If some of you follow what's happening in telecoms in Africa, Safaricom is the company which has the largest market share in terms of the mobile money platform. And Safaricom partners with the bank which is called the Commercial Bank of Africa. The largest shareholder in the Commercial Bank of Africa is the Kenyatta family. The Kenyatta family would be something like, let's say, I don't know if the Gandhis were to own a bank. The Kenyatta family is as big as that. And they are the largest shareholder in the largest mobile telephony platform in Kenya. If that wasn't using asymmetric power and for purposes of profit, we're not sure what really is. In Nigeria, the entire, we know about India. In Nigeria, interestingly, and Lagos is the next financial hub, or already the emerging financial hub of Africa, most of the startups and fintech companies are actually working on this digital identity and digital inclusion platform. They're all very thinly regulated. Nobody knows what's going on. This is not to say that fintech is an area that should be sort of discouraged. It's genuinely African economies are making a lot of advances in terms of technology. But what we're saying is we're not quite sure of the ability of the state to enforce, or the ability of the state to have oversight and make sure that they're not abusing this asymmetry of power. And as I just spoke to you about this revolving door between private sector and the fintech revolution, but it is all put down as, well, this is good for digital inclusion, really. But this is where, so that was the power of the private sector. Dangerous, but not as dangerous as what seems to be happening with how digital identity is being used for political exclusion. And really, there is no other better example than what's happening in India, in fact, in a state that neighbors Bangladesh, in Assam. Here's the interesting thing. The Aadhaar card, when it started being sort of given out and people had to enroll, it was meant to be for better targeting of welfare. It was meant to stop leakages in welfare entitlements that people had. It was never meant to be a card which would identify your citizenship. That was never the case. The Aadhaar Act is still fairly clear. If you read the earlier documents, it's still fairly clear. From there, we have now, in 2019, moved to a situation where without an Aadhaar card, you're no longer an Indian citizen. That, Imran, I believe that you had a question about what function creep is. We really can't think of a worse example of what function creep is, where you substantively change the context of a function. The Aadhaar card was meant for you to better be able to claim your entitlements. It was never meant for us to go and claim citizenship. That's what it was never supposed to be. And that is function creep. That is what our title is about, right? When inclusion excludes. The Aadhaar was supposed to include everybody. The Aadhaar is being used to exclude. 1.9 million Indian citizens are due to be packed into internment camps right now as we speak, on the basis of the Aadhaar. The National Register of Citizens, which the Modi government wants to now take national, will definitely have Aadhaar as key in terms of how to identify yourself as a citizen or not, and then the state decides what to do with you. Assam has a curiously, a different sort of political mix, and I'm not going to go into that. We can talk about it during the questions, but this definitely had a political, who are the minorities, whether they're religious minorities as Muslims or linguistic minorities as Bengalis, it does not matter. This was used to exclude minorities, and the function creep is something that I just spoke about. So that's what we see in the case of Aadhaar. Blockchain, we were having a conversation before we sat here on this panel about how blockchain, again, is another magic bullet, but it's been around for a bit. It's been around for almost 5-6 years. And Andhra Pradesh, again, an Indian state which is pretty much at the forefront of digital technology, has been trying to use blockchain to digitize and really assert on property rights and land records, because there was some talk of acquiring land for a new capital in the new state. But here's the thing. Before you actually create the digital ledger, the data has to be included manually. And at that point of intervention, you still find instances of bribe taking, you still find instances of coercion. So matters might have come down, but what do you do at the point of manual intervention? Once again, and these are just small examples that we are talking about. The most interesting example that did not get talked about in Indian media, it was picked up by very few in Indian media, and the Financial Times picked it up, and the poor correspondent who reported on this story was targeted with a huge amount of trolling, but obviously, is that there is this consultancy company in the state of Maharashtra called Jarvis, which was very close to the ex-chief minister, the then chief minister of Maharashtra. They were actually given access to 150 million data points, caste, other kinds of identities, incomes, which they just should not, simply as a private sector consultancy, did not have any business getting access to, but they did. And it was actually possible to then trace their voting patterns, other kinds of, you can just imagine what kind of misuse this sort of access to data might provide. So this is, again, a very good example of the kind of exclusion that Mushtaq is talking about, and the link between 3 and 2 that we are talking about. There is some more in South Africa. In Kenya, another extremely interesting and relevant example for us. If you're not from one of the 42 officially recognized tribes in Kenya, it's extremely difficult for you to get the new Kenyan identity card. It's called the Huduma number, which means the service number, basically, in Swahili. And it's interesting that it's modeled almost on the Aadhaar. The Aadhaar isn't explicit about citizenship. The Huduma number is almost explicit about citizenship. But in many other ways, it tries to replicate what the Aadhaar is trying to do. Similarly, if you're not from one of the main tribes, it is extremely difficult for you to access that digital identity card. And far more than in South Asia, Africa is where tribal identities still matter for political mobilization. And we actually see a lot of unfortunate potential for digital identity cards to be misused in the context of Africa. And Kenya already pretty much, unfortunately, shows what's possible. We've got a few other examples in Sudan and Zanzibar. What happens is tribal leaders are simply allowed to vouch for you, to say, well, I know this person, because most of us in developing country contexts don't have birth certificates or driver's licenses or even passports. So the tribal leader in Tanzania is actually able to say, well, I know the person, she lives next door. That if you don't like the person who lives next door, well, here is an opportunity for you to say, well, I don't know the person, she's not been around, and therefore you use your power to exclude somebody who doesn't have any form of redress. Do I have any more on this? No. I'll leave it at that, and over to Mushtaq.
Thank you. So, I mean, you could ask, these kinds of exclusion happened all the time anyway, but remember one comparison, right? In Myanmar, it took them 30 years first to destroy all the identity papers of the Rohingyas, then to burn them, and then slowly to create pressure on them to say you are not citizens. In India, you can do it in 5 seconds. You don't need to wait 30 years anymore. You can press a button and the Aadhaar numbers of 1.9 million people can disappear. And you can simply say you are now in an internment camp. So, yes, the powerful always did bad things, but now they can do it much more efficiently. And I think this efficiency that has come from access to this technology is something that we are not fully aware of yet and haven't taken account of. And it's not just about citizenship, it's about political competition between political parties. We had this example from India. I just want to reiterate these things because these are really important. Who can use this information for what purpose in a context where rules cannot be fully enforced is a serious issue. Now, the final box 4 is the one which is always highlighted in discussions of the good things that can happen with digital identities. And this is the box where asymmetric information really is the problem. So this violation is when a less powerful person is violating a rule which need not be violated. Basically what is happening here are low-level functionaries, low-level bureaucrats stealing the line of grain coming down to the village. Low-level bureaucrats making money disappear. This is asymmetric information par excellence, right? This is pure asymmetric information. I'm the bureaucrat, I know who is supposed to get this grain of rice or this piece of whatever subsidy, I don't give it. When digital identity comes in their own self-interest, very high likelihood that more senior politicians or more senior bureaucrats will say, I didn't get a share of that, I'm going to stop this. And this is exactly what happens in the most highlighted cases of success, of which we will now hear some.
Well, my turn now. This one's actually quite short and simple. We have seen from instances in India about, in India on how the Aadhaar card has actually helped stop entitlement fraud. But this fraud has been, and some excellent work done by, if anybody is interested, people like Ritika Khera, Jean Drège, a name that some of you might be very familiar with. They've broken down the fraud into 3 kinds. One is identity fraud, one is eligibility fraud, and the other is quantity fraud. And they've actually seen that, yes, you can stop identity fraud because I now have an Aadhaar card, I can go to a ration card, and I can demand the fact that this is me, you can identify who I am, and please give me whatever subsidized rice that I'm entitled to. But they've actually found, while that has been curbed, what we call eligibility fraud, which is I might be me, but I'm not sure that I'm entitled. Am I eligible? A card can't simply solve the problem of eligibility, and there is still a lot of scope for fraud on that. And more importantly, quantity. I might be me, I might be eligible, but I might be entitled to 25 kilos of rice and I end up getting only 10 kilos of rice. And that frequently happens with the Aadhaar. The Aadhaar hasn't been able to stop these other 2 kinds of fraud, which are actually the 2 most harmful kinds of fraud in any public distribution system. So yes, it has been able to stop identity fraud. One of the main reasons why the Aadhaar was supposed to be helpful and why the World Bank and other organizations like the GSMA pushed the Aadhaar was to stop identity fraud. But the other 2 really haven't taken place. In Nigeria, they've had some sort of success. The government was able to actually delete 43,000 ghost workers, as they called it, from an old legacy payroll system. So yes, it does work in certain cases. And this is an Indian government claim. The 40 million is an Indian government claim. It's very hard to verify, but then this was picked up by a fairly credible publication. So we've used it, which is that in terms of subsidies, about 40 million false subsidies were identified and weeded out. Maybe not 40 million, there's space for margin of error there, but it is possible that this happens. So yes, quadrant 4, digital identities can help, but with the caveats that, Mushtaq will reiterate now.
So now we are basically summarizing our analysis, and we basically say there are two boxes or two types of violations which we have helpfully colored green, where digital identities are both theoretically expected to reduce fraud, and the empirical evidence shows that in fact fraud comes down, and citizens' rights improve and delivery of services improves. Exactly as the theory says it should, we find a lot of studies aligned with that theoretical expectation. But, and this is the really huge big but, there are these two other boxes which we have helpfully colored orange, and they're linked, and these are the areas where political extraction and economic extraction by the private sector can be expected to improve or enhance, and we find that. And this gets linked with extractive practices from SMEs and others, including and up to the closing down of many SMEs and what we call premature formalization. And we find evidence of that too. So far, people have been basically looking at box 4, the fraud cases, and ignoring the other 3 boxes, and particularly ignoring boxes 2 and 3. Okay, so I'll now leave it to Pallavi to summarize the policy implications.
This would be a really quick rundown. There's no point in conducting research till we have some practical implications to talk to donors and policymakers about. Right, UIDs, we began with this, they've exacerbated power asymmetries, we know why authoritarian countries, and it's not authoritarian countries want it, most countries want it. The interesting thing is the authoritarian countries are developing the technologies. That's what we also wanted to highlight. Most countries in Africa would actually love to gain digital identity systems. So yes, the fact that something that is a tool for inclusion allows you to exclude is obviously a good policy tool for a lot of authoritarian regimes around the world, some of them in South Asia, some of them in Africa. One way of preventing this from happening? China. Sorry. Yeah, the elephant in the room. The Chinese are developing absolutely the most sophisticated surveying systems. There's an interesting story that we were discussing. The reason why the Chinese are so desperate to sell their surveillance technology to Africa is, well, the surveillance technology only works if you have a multiplicity of facial types, right? And China does not have a multiplicity of racial types, and which is exactly why, for its surveillance technology, it wants to move into Africa, and the Africans, of course, are extremely keen to have that. So that's just an interesting sidelight of this. Now, one way to prevent this kind of capture, so to say, by regimes is to sort of make sure. I've stolen a word from this book that's a favorite of mine called Lord of the Rings. Some of you might be aware of it. It's one ring to rule them all, which is one digital identity which oversees everything, right? So the idea is to break it down, not have a digital identity-based system which links to everything that we do in our life, whether it's finance, whether it's our driving license, whether it's tax, but to try and break it down. Now that, I know for a lot of policymakers here, the idea is, well, that will increase administrative costs, but it reduces the political cost, and that's what one is extremely worried about here. It's really the political cost. And one way, because donors are so, implicated is a wrong word, but donors are so interested in creating digital identity systems and systems of inclusion. One lever that we have, and it's been quite successful, to be very fair to some of the donors, pressure on donors to recognize the risks of political exclusion, that can be sort of unleashed with these identity systems. So at least target international partners. And this is a debate that Mushtaq and I keep having. How much should we be telling donors or audiences like this that there needs to be a legal architecture around digital inclusion systems? And I think we grudgingly come around to the fact that there needs to be a legal architecture, because if we have to live with the reality that these digital identity systems are going to be a part of our lives, we then also need to have, whether it's data privacy, privacy, what constitutes privacy in our context, we need some kind of a legal architecture backing that. And it's important because, incidentally, some of the successes And the pushback against these identity systems have actually come from the legal system. And in India, the whole idea of right to privacy came in only after the Aadhaar was defined. And people said, well, what is my right to privacy? And the Supreme Court defined that. In Kenya, the High Court again pushed back on what the Huduma number could be used and could not be used for. So in a sense, developing that legal capability is also very important. Legal opt-outs. Now, this might be a bit of pie in the sky that I don't want to be part of the Aadhaar. Technically, it still exists. But most of us can't be part of the Aadhaar. They're just starting this whole thing of linking PAN cards and Aadhaars very soon. But again, donors should push for, if I don't want to be part of it, and I have another system, say if I have a passport or an election identity card, that should be enough to establish who I am. That's what we mean. Identities are important. The other thing that's important in the African context is that we increasingly keep seeing this notion of statistical capacity. How much do I know about the data that exists in my country? South Asia, in that sense, we find is slightly better than most of the African contexts that we work in. And the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which is an excellent sort of third sector organization working in development in Africa, actually came back and said that the environment and social statistics subscore, which is basically statistical data on environmental or social issues, is extremely poor. But in terms of financial issues, it's quite high. And most of the digital technology today is actually being pushed out for financial inclusion. So once again, we are the whole aspect of, well, what are my environmental standards, what are the social issues that I need to be looked at, these are going to get short shrift. The digital identity push is going to be largely on the basis of what financial sector data that I have. And linked to this issue is this, it's as I said, now Ghana wants to do everything possible with its digital identity policy without possibly doing an audit. In countries in similar states don't do audits of what data that they already have or what data that they require. It's just, let's go with this, let's go with digital identities, quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. They certainly work in quadrant 4. That's why we need to put all our money into digital identity systems without questioning what they already have. So, and we actually do see some success. I think Mushtaq began with this. A lot of donors are actually beginning to realize that the Aadhaar model isn't the sort of model of exclusion, the benchmark model of exclusion that one needs to look at. And donors are beginning to look at slightly more hybrid, of inclusion. My bad, it's been a long day. Modes of inclusion that it's purported to be. And they're looking at a more hybrid system. Let's not link it all up. Let's be careful about what the political costs might be. And it seems to be working. So I shall end there. Mushtaq, maybe you want to round up?
No, I think that's fine. So I think you've got enough to think about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Extremely thought-provoking. And I'm sure we're going to have questions. So we have I'm really pleased. We have just appropriate discussing panel here, on this issue. So we have Kamal Kadir, CEO of Bikash. We have Anil Chaudhary, Policy Advisor of A2I, and we have Naeem Razak, MP. So we have a whole spectrum of questions that I think we'll sort of hear, and sort of reactions from people working in the world of sort of digital innovations and implementation to a politician as well, like Naeem here. So I'll just start off with Kamal Kadir. So because we started 15 minutes late, so I think we want to finish by 6:45. So I'm looking at about 10 minutes max per discussion. Thank you.
Well, Imran, when you asked me to be in this panel, my first reaction was that, I'm not aware about the paper. And this is Kamal, it's in your area of work, and you would be able to figure out while you are there. So no, he's grossly wrong. Okay. So in any area we work, it has so much specialization. So even in the peripheral area that we touch, that there are. So I wouldn't be able to make much comment on many of the stuff. But I think one of the main reason I believe I have been invited by Imran Mateen is because as a practitioner, I am part of Bikash, and that's what makes probably me be qualified to be here. There are two things, and Pallavi and Mushtaq bhai to share from our context here. Because, and I'll give a little bit of an intro to Bikash to bring things in the right context. So we use IDs twice. So one ID you use is the mobile phone number as a identification for an account. And the other thing we do, and the reason we use mobile phone instead of an email address, because in a country like ours, people do not often have email address. People also would be difficult for them to type email address through a mobile or digital device. So we use mobile number because that's the most common thing that people know over here. In this context, I'm going to also share when mobile financial service was designed by the regulator, there was a lot of debate. Should we call it mobile financial service or should we call it digital financial service? One of the reasons they settled with mobile financial service because they said everybody knows the word mobile, let's stick to the word mobile, even the fundamental is the same thing. And the second reason is that every account when in DFS or MFS like Bikash, when an account is created, that account is again verified with national ID card. Okay, and I think that's the two areas where the IDs are used. Now, in the context of Bangladesh, and there's so many things I've learned today, it's important to see that we are a regulated service. And everything that is done here, and that's what one area Bangladesh is quite ahead compared to many countries, is prescribed by the regulator. And in the context of our practice, the regulation has evolved. And in the case of regulation, 18 months of feedback was taken. So these are the kind of practices I feel in some countries the practice could make things a little bit better because even though it's regulated, even the regulation had feedback, that allows us to operate in a space that is not just a policy maker, not just a bureaucrat just simply prescribed something, but the prescription has also received feedback from many different sources. Now, the benefit that we see, I mean, some of the things that I was going through the brief paper that I received after coming here is one in the case of factory workers. Another is in the case of government subsidy programs, the safety net programs. I think the ID has tremendously helped. Okay, and not only it helped because it is cross-checked with the two other IDs that I mentioned earlier. The benefit goes directly to the person intended. That is one benefit we see here. Regarding Kenya, I am not aware, Pallavi, that whether Kenya is the benchmark country, and I am not just simply aware who made that benchmark. There are some countries who actively avoided following Kenya's model, and Bangladesh happened to be one such country, where in the case of financial inclusion, Bangladesh did not follow the way Kenya went, rather it went to the other direction. Now, when I see this, the points you are making and Mushtaq bhai, so what I gather, the fundamental point is regulation, and if we can have the regulation, then many of those issues can be evolving and can be solved along with it. I mean, I can speak as a practitioner. When mobile financial service started in Bangladesh, has the regulator resolved all the challenges they are going to face going forward? Answer is most likely no. Okay, but over time there are some of the challenges that came and that got addressed. I mean, it was a bit funny when we saw Mark Zuckerberg mentioning to the U.S. Congress that we need regulation. Okay, well, in some countries, regulation actually came first and then came the service, so there are definitely much to learn from making sure regulation works. And on that regulation part, we can come back and speak about it more. But I think an overall attitude is very important. Is that it's not acting as a gap seeker and really trying to plug in those gaps as we are providing public services that reaches millions of people. Not really looking for cracks and trying to pass through those cracks. As long as those practices are maintained and the regulations are brought to light, then I think we can address many of the challenges that you mentioned.
Thank you. I'd now like to go to Anil Chaudhary.
Imran bhai, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting discussion, and thank you Mushtaq bhai and Pallavi for the wonderful, thought-provoking, eye-opening presentation. I go to a lot of ID discussions around the world, not just in Bangladesh, but in different countries. But I think I can say with pretty much high level of certainty that this has been the most thought-provoking and eye-opening presentation that I have seen on ID. So thank you for that, to both of you. This is also very timely because we are designing the UID for Bangladesh by combining national ID and birth registration. So working with a number of institutions, number of government institutions, and we formed a civil registration secretariat at the cabinet, headed by the cabinet secretary. So it has about 20 members, about 15 or so secretaries from different ministries, and a few other DGs. So it's a very complex, time-consuming, arduous process, but we have to get it right. So the fact that you're bringing this presentation at a time when we are designing this, I think is I appreciate that. About 2 years ago, I was at a conference, a small closed group conference in Bangalore, where Nandan was talking about Aadhaar, extolling the virtues of Aadhaar, which you just dispelled just now. But there was a study showed by CGAP. CGAP is a World Bank hosted organization focusing on financial inclusion and recently focusing on digital IDs and digital financial inclusion. The study had two parts. One was research done in the Western countries, another was research done in developing countries. So developed countries and developing countries. And some of the things that you talk about, how IDs are seen, so by developed country practitioners and citizens, it's seen as a violation of privacy. But in developed countries, it was seen as an enabler of services. So that was the general, I don't know how biased it was, but that was what was showed to us. But after looking at your presentation, I think of a few scenarios. I think of the book 1984, Ultimate Big Brother. I think of maybe nuclear power, how it could be used for killing people or generating electricity. And I think of the subprime mortgage crisis, that you are not focusing on the fundamentals. So ID by itself is not an enabler. ID tied to some physical, non-digital, non-ID enablers can actually take you the extra mile. I think that's the link that you have just proven. So we need to understand better what that linkage is and take the society, take the policymakers, take the lawmakers towards that. Because that understanding, I mean, I've studied ID in some level of detail. I've been doing digitization for over 12 years now in Bangladesh. And if I look at my career, for 25 years plus. But I think this linkage, and again, I am deeply, deeply grateful that you brought a level of understanding that I did not have, even just half an hour ago. So I think those things need to be understood better. So like Kamal said, digitization has brought benefits. Digital ID also has brought benefits. I mean, we started bottom up in terms of digitizing our services. We started with the union parishads in Bangladesh, which are similar to panchayats in India. So we did not start from the cities. We actually started from the bottom when there was not even connectivity. Even the 2G connectivity was missing. But that's what we pushed for the last 11 years, and we're seeing some benefits of it. So bottom-up development, so a very keen, deliberate, uncompromising focus on the bottom-up, I think is useful. I think you've talked about some of that. So we see from the union councils, by digitizing about 700 services, that about 150 or so are given from the union councils. We are seeing savings by citizens. We are saving about 2 billion person days in the last 10 years. We have saved about $8 billion by citizens, not the government. And we have saved about 1 billion visits. So you actually cut down visits because you don't have to go to a district DC office to get your land record, because you can apply from the union council, union Purusha. So those are the savings that we are seeing. So it is useful, but again, the threats are also there. Threats of surveillance, threats of loss of privacy. We may not care much about privacy, but we will very soon. When we know what this means, I think we will care about privacy very soon. The title of the presentation, I think, is also very telling. Inclusion excludes. I think the intent to include, I think, we've excluded. And the first time I saw a very stark example of that in Bangladesh is when the UNHCR has developed the digital ID for the refugees in Bangladesh, and it was really targeting. It was designed for exclusion, and this is not just in Bangladesh. It's in Turkey, it's in Jordan, it's for 70 plus million refugees around the world. The number is going up. We're going to have in the next 20 years apparently 500 million refugees. So it is designed to exclude. Digital ID is going to be for all refugees, and it is designed to exclude. So it's very telling. I take away 4 things. Actually, no. Let me actually talk about a book that I was reading recently by Andrew Keane, How to Fix the Future. I don't know if you've read that book. He's written 3 books, I think. The last 2 are actually related to this. The last one was called Internet is Not the Answer, which is where he started criticizing the FANGs and the ubiquitous presence of Internet and how it has helped and harmed. And then this recent book is called How to Fix the Future, which is where he actually proposes 5 things. I've written those 5 things just as I was listening to your presentation. So he talks about competitive innovation, which is where breaking the monopoly of the FANGs. So he actually outlines certain ways of doing that. And Pallavi's discussion of iSpirit, I see iSpirit as a way of breaking that monopoly. It is an open source platform. It is done by the guys who've developed Aadhaar. But I feel I've interacted with many of them. It seems like a sincere effort to open up that technology so that anybody could actually see what's inside and change it. So you can regulate through code in a way. So that's one way we could, if you look at it seriously, obviously we may not understand code or may not understand technology, but there are some who do, and we can help them or guide them with the right kind of legal architecture for ID, perhaps. The second thing he talks about is a very deliberate government regulation that will help breaking the monopoly and find the right legal architecture. The third thing he talks about is consumer choice that drives the government regulations. It's not the other way around. So government doesn't wake up one day and then come up with a DFS or an MFS regulation. It's driven by choice. And we have a lot of evidence. You talk about a lot of examples that could give us evidence and make informed regulation decisions driven by consumer choice. The third one he talks about is social responsibility by business leaders. I really don't know what this means. Maybe you do. Education and awareness development for all kinds of stakeholders. So that's the fifth thing. That also I don't know what it means. Because what kind of regulation, what kind of education, what kind of awareness, so I think we need to probably figure that out. So I take away 4 things from this. One is that we have to prevent ID to become a tool for surveillance. I think it's happening in China, we are seeing evidence of that. It's probably happening in other countries, neighboring countries, in our own country perhaps. The legal architecture around digital ID, I think that's also important. World Bank has created a group called ID for D, ID for Development, and they are looking at many of these, but they swear by Aadhaar. So they swear by Aadhaar, and everything is built around Aadhaar. Any kind of awareness, any kind of design, technology, legal, policy. So it's all around Aadhaar. But it is a powerful group because they are advising many of the developing countries, and they are advising other donors. So it's backed by Gates Foundation, backed by Omidyar, backed by MasterCard. So it's a powerful group that's going all over the place, and we are also working with them. But I think this presentation, if they have not seen it, they should see it. Third thing is educating donors. It's very important for the developing countries. I'm sure the kinds of language that you've used will be appealing to the donors. And the fourth is, it's not just about ID or digital ID, it's about the fundamentals. So it's not about, otherwise we'll actually create a digital ID form of subprime mortgage crisis. So those are the few things I take away from this. But what I will suggest is, if you have time, I would like to arrange a broader discussion on this with policymakers, lawmakers, academicians, maybe entrepreneurs, industrialists, so that they understand what could potentially happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I'd like to request Honorable Member of Parliament Naim Razak for his remarks, please.
Thank you so much, and of course, very eye-opening presentation, and I do have to admit that Anir Bhai and Kamal Bhai is much more in the relevant industry to actually talk about this thing. But of course, from a lawmaker's point of view, I just want to entertain a couple of questions to go with it. Of course, every action has a reaction. Every aspect has its pros and the cons, and a coin would have two sides of it. I just want to pick one word that was picked up by Anil Bhai, of course, from him, that it is the intent. What do we do with it? Of course, society is driven by the need to excel. So hence the question comes in whether digital identity is a necessity. In this day and age, of course, it seems like it is a necessity. And with the notion that it is a necessity, what do we do with it? Whether there is a counteractive measures to see through that these datas that we call digital identity is used for the benefit, as been highlighted in the first paragraph of the presentation, and of course the keynote as to, what is it supposed to do? Does it lead to a decrease in corruption, inefficiency in service delivery, high cost of doing business, and security threats, and XYZ. So the question first needs to be asked whether it is a necessity. And the way we go with it, of course, Anil Bhai has been in the forefront of digital transformation. Our honorable advisor to the Prime Minister, Shajib Wajid, has been the architect, we call it, in terms of digital Bangladesh, and hence A2I has been in the forefront. So how do we approach it? Do we take an approach to segment-wise approach? Because we cannot have a unilateral approach to everything. So whether we talk about the telecommunication industry or the MFS, which is Kamal Bhai has mentioned, voter ID, which is very essential in terms of seeing through the voting rights of the people and not having multiple identities and overlappings and so forth. So the rules and regulations by law, when we derive rules and regulations through it, and the way we see, and I see, in fact, in terms of the digital age, it is a work in progress. Every day and age, we are having to face something or the other. Again, we are having to cope with it, and then we are having to take aspect of it, but also we need to see the positive sides of it. Then only we can approach it. Of course, we are talking about Aadhaar. I don't want to comment because I'm in the Foreign Affairs Committee, so it would be unwise to comment on another country's policy, but that's one question, of course, to the audience, and I would, of course, want the presenters to take more questions of it. The second thing is whether we need data. Do we need data? In this day and age, of course, data is everything. And one of the comments that was passed by Pallavi is that, whether we need one singular digital identity which links everything together. Whether that brings efficiency, of course, I personally think it brings more efficiency. In terms of, let's say, now in this day and age, monetary flow needs to be monitored. Where it is going, what is going. Not only talking about tax evasion, but also talking about, whether it is an investment which is made on harboring terrorists, harboring security aspects of it and so forth. So definitely there is a need to it. But we need a strong Data Protection Act to prevent a misuse of data. Now, of course, I'll come to the first thing is that whether we have the intent. Whether a country which is, let's say the government has the intent to misuse it, misappropriation of data, and then of course do a lot of things. And that is why the whole commotion was come across of data analytics, right? Cambridge Analytics we talk about, and other things, how Facebook and social media is targeting audiences and so forth, so forth, so forth. Now there is, of course, we have talked about it, now there are adequate measures have been taken. So from a policy point of view, I think we always have to think beyond the notion that yes, what it could happen. Let's not be pessimist about it, rather be optimistic. But at the same time, this sort of presentations, of course, as Anil Bhai said, needs to be catered for a much more wider audience, where we know where is the safety precautions that needs to be adopted, so that misuse of these data are not done and so forth. So I just want to, my contribution to the whole argument is that we need strong data prevention acts, digital acts. At the same time, we need to oversee the misuse of data, and of course, hence we need to see the intent of where this digital identity will go with. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I know all of you have been waiting very, very patiently. So let's get some questions. Okay, let me just show of hands, please. 1, 2, 3. Let's take those 3.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really food for thought for me. I have one question regarding the function creep. So if there has been parallel digital inclusion, for an example in Bangladesh, Mr. Anir Chaudhary already said Bangladesh is looking forward to developing UID and birth registration. Under the Bureau of Statistics, they have national household data of 90 million people, and they collect data of 77 different fields from a particular family. So there is a huge data, I think one of the largest social registry in Bangladesh, in entire world. So I'm not sure whether the government of Bangladesh is synchronizing this data among different government agencies or not. If not, if the parallel attempt of collecting data, digital inclusion goes on, I fear that it will lead to function creep, because the same data of the same household collected by different government agencies might produce, collected from different perspectives, might produce different results. So what is your thought in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there was one question here first, and then I'll come to you. Yes.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Ms. Pallavi and Mr. Mushtaq Khan. That was a total mindfuck. I cannot find a better word other than that.